Move along. This isn't your fight.
It's always been my fight.
That's enough.
They thought no one would notice. They thought no one would care. But they didn't see the quiet dignity in the way he carried his cane, or the fire that still burned in a heart they thought was blind. They tossed a blind veteran in public. 5 minutes later, a military convoy shut it all down. Subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video, because the strongest stands are the quietest, and some debts can never be erased. The morning was quiet, the sun a soft gold against the winter sky as Marvin Smith tapped his white cane across the icy curb. The small clicks echoed in the hush, each step a measured breath against the cold. His breath came in soft clouds, his hand steady on the worn handle of the cane that had become as much a part of him as the calm determination in his chest. He'd learned long ago how to read the world without his eyes. The rush of cars, the shuffle of feet, the way the wind changed when a bus passed by, they all painted the map he carried in his mind. And today, like every day, he trusted those quiet details more than he'd ever trusted the noise of the world around him. The light changed, and Marvin stepped forward, the rhythm of the crosswalks beeping signal his guide. Each footstep was careful, deliberate. He had learned to move slow and sure, never letting the rush of the city push him out of his quiet balance. He was almost to the other side when he heard the harsh bark of a voice, young, angry, full of the kind of authority that didn't come from experience. "Hey, stop right there." Marvin paused, his hand tightening on his cane. "I'm just crossing," he said calmly, his voice low. The lights still green, but the voice didn't care. "I said stop," it snapped again. Footsteps scraped across the pavement, boots heavy and quick. Marvin felt the shift in the air, the cold push of someone who thought force was the same as respect. A hand grabbed his arm, fingers tight around the worn sleeve of his jacket. Marvin stiffened, the shock of the contact a jolt through his bones. "Sir," he said quietly, the word a breath of warning. "Let go. Show me your ID," the voice demanded, the fingers tightening further. "You're obstructing traffic." Marvin turned his head, his face calm but his voice edged in iron. "I'm a veteran," he said. "This is my right." But the hand didn't ease. "I don't care who you are," the voice spat. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." For a moment, there was just the hush of the winter morning, the small sounds of the city holding their breath. Then there was a crackle of static, the hiss of a radio keyed open, and the soft click of a safety switch being flicked off. Marvin's shoulders stiffened, the quiet calm in his chest turning to cold resolve. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. But the world didn't listen. He felt the shock of the taser before he heard it, the searing jolt of pain that ripped through him like fire, every muscle in his body seizing tight. His cane fell to the ground, the clatter swallowed by the low murmur of the crowd that had gathered at the edge of the street. He couldn't see the faces around him, but he could feel them, the quiet horror, the way breath caught in the cold air. The city had paused for a moment, the small sounds of life held in the soft, breathless hush of a crowd that didn't know how to look away. Marvin fell to his knees, the taste of cold metal in his mouth, the pain still humming through his veins. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one a quiet promise. He would not break. The young officer stepped back, his voice uncertain now, the edge of anger dulled by the weight of the eyes watching him. "He was resisting," he said, but the words sounded thin, the false authority already cracking. Marvin closed his eyes, his hand groping for the white cane that had fallen at his side. He didn't find it, but he didn't need it to stand. Because in that quiet moment, in the hush of the winter morning, the weight of 1,000 silent witnesses in the air, he knew the truth. He would not be moved. Not today. Not ever. The quiet that followed was a kind of heavy hush, a silence that seemed to hold every breath, every heartbeat, in the cold winter air. Marvin could feel it pressing in around him, the weight of 100 unseen eyes. He pulled himself upright slowly, the tremble in his limbs a quiet echo of the taser's shock. His breath was ragged, his chest tight with the cold and the burn of defiance. The white cane lay on the pavement at his feet, its familiar shape a promise he clung to in the sudden, uncertain stillness. "Sir, you need to stay down," the young officer said again, but his voice had lost its edge. It was a whisper now, a flicker of doubt in the cold morning light. Marvin turned his head slightly, his face calm despite the pain. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "You can't take that from me." The officer didn't answer. He shifted from foot to foot, the weight of his vest and the cold metal of the taser suddenly heavy in his hands. Around them, the crowd pressed closer. Small sounds of protest, soft murmurs of disbelief, the quiet push of questions in every breath. Marvin didn't need to see their faces to feel the shift in the air. The city was watching now, the cold indifference of the morning replaced by something sharper, a quiet fury that hummed in the hush. Then he heard it. The low, steady growl of engines, the slow, deliberate rhythm of tires on cold pavement. A sound that didn't belong to the city's normal rush. A sound that spoke of order, of precision, of a promise that no man would stand alone. He lifted his head, his hand tightening around the empty air where his cane should have been. The young officer turned, his shoulders stiffening as the first of the dark green vehicles rounded the corner, the heavy shape of military trucks moving in silent formation. The convoy came to a stop at the edge of the street, the rumble of engines falling away into a hush that was somehow even heavier than before. The doors opened with the quiet click of discipline, and soldiers stepped out. Crisp uniforms, eyes calm and focused, the soft gleam of their medals catching the pale winter light. The crowd gasped, the small sound cutting through the hush like the crack of a rifle. Marvin felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest, the quiet promise of those who had come not with weapons, but with the simple, steady surety of men who stood for something more than orders. The young officer's mouth opened, a protest half-formed in the cold air, but it died before it could find breath. Because in the calm line of soldiers, in the quiet authority that radiated from every silent step, there was no room for doubt. A tall man in a dark coat stepped forward, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. His voice was low and sure, a calm thread in the heavy hush. "Sergeant Marvin Smith," he said quietly. "You're coming with us." Marvin didn't move at first. The weight of the shock, the ache in his chest, the raw edge of defiance in his breath. It all held him in place for a moment that felt as long as the winter sky. Then he nodded once, the smallest of movements, but enough. He reached down, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his fallen cane, and found his strength in the quiet steadiness of the soldiers who had come for him. Because he understood now, in the hush of the crowd, in the slow, steady breath of the world that had paused to watch, that some stands didn't need words. Some stands spoke in the quiet promise of men who remembered the weight of a uniform, the quiet power of loyalty, and the simple, unbreakable truth that no one who had ever served would stand alone. The tall man in the dark coat stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on Marvin's shoulder. Not a command, but a quiet promise. Marvin felt the calm strength in that touch, the surety of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. "You're safe now, Sergeant," the man said softly, his voice low and sure in the winter air. "We're here to see you home." Marvin let out a slow breath, the ache of the taser's jolt still humming in his bones but no longer the weight it had been. Around them, the soldiers formed a quiet wall, their calm presence an anchor against the lingering buzz of the crowd's disbelief. The young officer who had tossed him took a step back, his eyes wide and uncertain. The man in the dark coat turned his gaze to him, his expression calm but unyielding. "Stand down," he said simply, and the weight of those words seemed to settle the air like a blanket of snow. The officer swallowed, his shoulders stiffening as he clipped his taser back to his belt. I was just following," he began, but the man cut him off with a single soft shake of his head. "You've done enough," he said. "Go." The officer hesitated, his mouth working silently, then turned and disappeared into the small knot of city police at the edge of the square. Marvin didn't watch him go. His focus was on the quiet, calm faces of the soldiers around him, the slow, sure movements of men who had come not to threaten, but to stand. The man in the dark coat turned back to Marvin, his mouth lifting in a small, steady smile. "We've got a convoy ready," he said. "If you're ready." Marvin reached down, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his fallen cane. One of the soldiers stepped forward, lifting it from the icy pavement with the quiet care of someone who understood what it meant to stand. He placed it gently in Marvin's hand, his eyes meeting his with a silent respect. "Thank you," Marvin said softly, his voice a rasp of breath in the cold air. The soldier just nodded. "Any time, sir." They moved together toward the waiting vehicles, the hush of the crowd parting around them like water, the soft thud of boots on the snow-dusted pavement, the steady rhythm of Bear's paws beside him. It was a quiet song, a promise of home in every step. As they reached the first of the military trucks, Marvin paused, his breath a cloud in the cold light. The man in the dark coat watched him, his expression patient. "You don't have to say anything," he said gently. "You've already said enough." Marvin nodded, his hand tightening on his cane. "I know," he said quietly, "but I want to say, thank you." The man smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes soft in the pale light. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, "for standing your ground." As Marvin climbed into the truck, the warmth of the heater washing over him, he felt the last of the day's cold ease from his chest. The convoy moved out, the steady rumble of engines a quiet promise in the hush of the winter morning. And as they drove away, Marvin let himself believe, for the first time in a long time, that he wasn't alone. Because some stands echo louder than any shout. Some promises never fade. And no man who had ever learned the quiet power of loyalty would ever stand alone again. The world beyond the window blurred into soft streaks of winter light as the convoy moved through the city. Marvin sat quietly in the back of the truck, his hand wrapped around the white cane that had become his compass through a world that too often tried to turn him around. Beside him, Bear rested his broad head on Marvin's leg, the dog's calm breathing a quiet rhythm that matched the low hum of the engine. Marvin reached down, his fingers brushing the dog's soft fur, and felt the slow, steady beat of his own heart settle into the quiet of the moment. Across from him, the man in the dark coat watched him with a calm, steady gaze. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly, his voice gentle against the low growl of tires on asphalt. Marvin let out a slow breath. "Sore," he said honestly, "but steady, like the world finally stopped spinning long enough for me to find my feet." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You stood your ground today," he said. "Not everyone can say that." Marvin shifted in his seat, the memory of the shock still humming in the quiet places of his bones. "It wasn't about making a scene," he said. "It was about not letting them decide where I belonged." The man's mouth twitched into the faintest of smiles. "You reminded everyone," he said, "not just the ones who saw it happen, but the ones who will hear about it. You reminded them that standing your ground doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be certain." Marvin looked down at Bear, the dog's eyes calm and sure in the pale light. "I didn't feel brave," he said softly. "I just couldn't let it stand." "That's enough," the man said. "Sometimes that's more than enough." The convoy turned onto a quieter street, the snow still clinging to the edges of the world in soft drifts. Marvin felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest, the quiet surety of men who had seen too much to ever take a stand lightly. The man leaned back, his gaze turning out the window. "We're taking you to the Veterans Center," he said. "There's a place there warm, safe, a place to catch your breath." Marvin nodded, the small movement enough. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low rasp. The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The hush in the truck, the quiet strength of the soldiers around them, spoke louder than any words could. As they rolled on through the soft hush of the city, Marvin let the quiet settle over him like a blanket. Outside, the world was still cold, still sharp with the noise of those who would always try to drown out the quiet strength of a man who knew how to stand. But in here, in the soft hum of the convoy, the steady beat of Bear's breathing, and the calm watch of men who knew what it meant to hold the line, He felt the echo of something stronger. Something that couldn't be stolen with a taser or silenced with a badge. A promise. That no one who stood their ground would ever stand alone. The Veterans Center was a warm glow against the winter dusk, the soft lamplight spilling onto the snow-dusted walk. The convoy pulled to a stop with quiet precision, and the door opened to let in the crisp evening air. Marvin stepped down slowly, the ache in his legs a reminder of the jolt that had brought him here. Bear moved beside him, each step measured and calm, the dog's quiet presence a steady promise. Inside, the air was warm, the hush of the room wrapping around him like a soft blanket. He could hear the low murmur of voices, men and women who spoke in the gentle rhythm of shared memory, the quiet weight of years woven into every breath. Director Lang was waiting by the door, his smile soft but certain. "Welcome, Sergeant," he said. "You're safe here." Marvin nodded, the small movement enough to speak the gratitude he didn't have words for. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with the raw edge of exhaustion. Lang gestured to a chair by the fire, its worn cushions a quiet invitation. "Sit," he said. "Rest." Marvin lowered himself into the chair, Bear settling at his feet with a soft sigh. The warmth of the fire sank into his bones, the low crackle of the flames a gentle rhythm in the hush of the room. Around him, the Veterans Center moved with the slow, sure grace of men and women who had learned how to carry the weight of the world in quiet steps. A man in an old Marine jacket offered him a cup of coffee, the bitter warmth of it steady in his hands. "You've done enough for today," the man said softly. "Let us stand for you now." Marvin let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing as he cradled the cup. He thought of the street, the cold slap of the pavement, the crackle of the taser's charge, the low murmur of the crowd. And he thought of the convoy, the quiet wall of soldiers who had come for him in the hush of a winter morning. "I didn't want to make a scene," he said quietly. "I just couldn't let it stand." The man nodded, his eyes kind. "That's what makes it matter," he said. "Not the noise. The choice." Marvin's hand tightened on the cane that lay across his lap, the worn with a quiet promise in the hush. Bear shifted, his head pressing against Marvin's knee, the dog's steady breath a silent anchor. Director Lang sat down across from him, his gaze calm and sure. "You've reminded us all," he said softly, "that the quietest stands can be the strongest. That even when the world tries to drown you out, the echo of one man's resolve can carry further than any shout." Marvin closed his eyes for a moment, the warmth of the fire and the steady hum of the room settling deep in his chest. When he opened them again, he felt the weight of the moment settle into something softer. Not a burden, but a quiet strength. Because he knew now that standing his ground wasn't about being seen or heard. It was about refusing to be moved, about trusting the quiet truth of his own breath. And as he sat in the warmth of that small room, the soft murmur of old warriors around him, he understood that what he had done would echo long after the night had faded. Because no man who stood with quiet dignity would ever truly stand alone. The warmth of the fire and the quiet murmur of the veterans around him wove together like a soft promise, a gentle echo in the hush of the winter night. Marvin sat with his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, the steam rising in slow curls, the bitter scent grounding him in the calm. Outside, the snow still fell, each flake a small miracle of light against the dark. Marvin let his breath slow, each quiet inhale a gentle tether to the moment, to the weight of what he had chosen to do. Colonel Davis entered the room then, his presence calm and sure. He walked with the quiet authority of a man who had seen the world's noise and learned to stand steady in the hush. He paused by Marvin's chair, his gaze steady but kind. "How are you feeling, Sergeant?" he asked softly. Marvin looked up, the warmth of the coffee still seeping into his hands. "Like I did what I had to," he said simply. Davis nodded, his mouth lifting in the faintest of smiles. "That's all any of us can do," he said. "But today you reminded everyone that dignity isn't given. It's claimed." Marvin let those words settle around him, the quiet weight of them a balm against the ache in his bones. I didn't feel brave, he said honestly. I just couldn't let it go. Davis's eyes softened. That's what bravery is, he said. Not the noise, not the speeches. It's the choice to stand when sitting down would be easier. Around them, the Veterans Center carried the hush of old stories and quiet courage. Marvin felt the echo of it in every breath. The soft promise of men and women who had learned that strength wasn't in the volume of your voice, but in the quiet steadiness of your stand. A young woman in fatigues approached, her face calm and her eyes bright. She knelt beside Bear, her hand resting gently on the dog's head. He's a good boy, she said softly. A steady friend. Marvin nodded, his fingers brushing the thick fur. He's been with me a long time, he said. He knows how to hold the line. Davis smiled faintly. Seems like you both do. The quiet in the room deepened, the crackle of the fire a soft drumbeat beneath the hush. Marvin let his breath slow, the tightness in his chest easing as he looked around at the faces of those who understood. Those who knew what it meant to stand when the world tried to push you down. Thank you, he said finally, his voice low but sure, for coming for me. Davis's hand rested on his shoulder, the weight of it a quiet anchor. We never leave our own behind, he said. Not today. Not ever. Marvin closed his eyes for a moment, the soft rhythm of Bear's breathing a steady beat in the quiet. When he opened them again, he felt the hush settle around him like a promise. A quiet echo that said no man who stood his ground would ever truly stand alone. Outside, the snow kept falling, each flake a testament to the quiet persistence of the world. And in the hush of that winter night, Marvin knew that his choice to stand would echo long after the cold had faded. A soft promise that no one who carried dignity in their heart would ever be silenced. The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows of the Veterans Center, soft and pale against the warm glow of the fire. Marvin sat quietly, his eyes half closed, listening to the slow rhythm of Bear's breathing and the faint murmur of the other veterans as they talked in low, steady voices. He felt the deep, quiet strength of the place settle in his bones, a calm he hadn't known he needed. The air smelled of coffee and wood smoke, familiar and grounding, like the slow, certain breath of a world that had learned to stand its ground. Colonel Davis sat across from him, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp and watchful. He sipped his own coffee, his fingers tapping lightly on the worn ceramic mug. "How's the pain?" he asked softly. Marvin shifted, his hand tightening on his cane. "It's there," he said, "but it's not what matters." Davis's mouth lifted in the faintest of smiles. "That's the thing about pain," he said. "It reminds us what we're fighting for, but it doesn't get to decide where we stand." Marvin nodded slowly, the simple truth of that sinking into the quiet places of his chest. "It's easier here," he admitted. "Easier to breathe." "That's because you're not alone," Davis said. "None of us are." He glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the faces of the veterans who had gathered in the dawn light. Men and women of every age, every story, their eyes carrying the same quiet surety. "These are the ones who know," he said softly. "The ones who understand that the loudest voice isn't always the truest." Marvin looked down at Bear, the dog's head resting on his knee, his eyes half closed in the hush. "He's always known," he said, "even when I didn't." Davis's gaze softened. "That's loyalty," he said, "the kind that doesn't ask for thanks, the kind that doesn't break when the world says it should." The words settled around them like the hush of snow on a quiet morning, a gentle weight, soft but certain. Marvin felt the last of the night's cold ease from his shoulders, the ache in his chest turning to something quieter, something steadier. He took a slow breath, the warmth of the coffee and the soft thump of Bear's tail anchoring him in the moment. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice low. Davis leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Now," he said softly, "now you keep doing what you've always done. You stand. You remind them that dignity doesn't come from a uniform or a badge. It comes from the choice to stand when it matters." Marvin nodded, the quiet resolve in those words settling deep in his chest. He felt the weight of the day ahead, the quiet battles, the small choices that spoke louder than any shout, and he knew he was ready. Outside, the city was waking up, the hush of dawn turning to the soft murmur of a world in motion. But inside the veteran's center, the calm remained. A quiet breath, a steady promise. Marvin rose slowly, his hand resting on Bear's head. He met Davis's gaze, the unspoken bond of those who had learned that sometimes the greatest strength was the quiet refusal to be moved. "Thank you," he said softly, "for everything." Davis nodded once, his expression calm and sure. "Any time, Sergeant," he said. "Any time." And as Marvin stepped out into the cold light of dawn, Bear at his side, he felt the quiet power of a choice made without noise. The simple, steady promise of a man who knew that no matter how loud the world shouted, the quietest stands were the ones that would echo the longest. The streets were still quiet as Marvin stepped out of the veteran's center, the cold air sharp and clean in his lungs. Bear walked close at his side, each step measured and sure, the quiet rhythm of his paws a soft echo in the winter hush. The sun was just beginning to warm the horizon, turning the snow to bright shards of light that caught at the edges of the world. Marvin felt the weight of the dawn settle into his bones, the kind of calm that came not from comfort, but from knowing you'd stood your ground when it mattered. He didn't hurry. Each step was a quiet promise, a steady refusal to let the noise of the world dictate the shape of his breath. He tapped his cane lightly against the pavement, the small clicks a soft rhythm that guided him forward. As he walked, the city began to stir, the low murmur of voices, the hush of engines turning over in the cold. Marvin felt the eyes of strangers on him sometimes, curious or uncertain, but he didn't let it touch him. He had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something you wore. It was something you carried. At the corner, a young man in a delivery uniform paused, his eyes widening as he took in the quiet presence of the veteran and his dog. "Sir," he said softly, his voice careful but warm. Are you all right?" Marvin turned his head slightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm fine," he said. "Just walking home." The young man hesitated, his gaze flicking to the white cane, to the calm set of Bear's shoulders. Then he nodded, a quiet respect in the way he stepped back to give them room. "Thank you for your service," he said. Marvin didn't answer, he just inclined his head, the small movement enough. He had never needed the words, not when the truth of who he was lived in the quiet weight of each breath he took. The rest of the walk was a slow, steady drift through the city's morning heart. He passed the small shops he had known for years, the worn awnings and bright window displays that marked the quiet pulse of a neighborhood that had seen too much to be impressed by noise. Each step was a small stand, a quiet defiance that said, "I'm still here, I'm still standing." When he reached the worn steps of his small apartment, he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the weathered railing. Bear pressed close to his leg, his dark eyes steady and calm. Marvin let out a slow breath, the hush of the winter morning wrapping around him like a promise. Inside, the air was warm, the hush of the old radiator filling the small space with a quiet murmur. Marvin set his cane by the door, his hand lingering for a moment on the worn wood. Then he turned to Bear, his mouth curving in a small, tired smile. "Good boy," he said softly, his voice low and sure. Bear wagged his tail once, the small movement a quiet echo of everything they had seen and everything they would still face. Marvin let the moment settle, the warmth of the room and the soft, steady rhythm of the dogs breathing a gentle anchor in the hush. Because he knew now, more than he had ever known before, that no matter how loud the world tried to shout, some promises didn't need to be spoken. Some stands didn't need to be explained. They just needed to be lived. The light of the winter morning poured through the small kitchen window, soft and bright against the worn tile floor. Marvin moved slowly as he filled the old kettle with water, the familiar hiss of the gas burner catching and flaring to life a comfort in the hush. Bear settled at his feet, his dark eyes watching every movement with quiet patience. The weight of the day before still sat in Marvin's bones, the echo of that moment when the world had tried to take his voice away. But in the soft light of the new morning, that weight didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a memory, a quiet testament to the choice he had made. He poured the hot water over the coffee grounds, the rich scent rising in a gentle swirl of steam. Each small motion, the slow turn of the spoon, the soft clink of the ceramic cup, felt like a kind of prayer, a quiet honoring of everything he had fought for. As he sat at the small table, the warmth of the mug steady in his hands, Marvin let his thoughts drift back to the street. The crackle of the taser, the cold slap of the pavement, the way the world had held its breath when the soldiers arrived. He could still feel the hush that had fallen, the quiet weight of respect in the faces of the crowd. He hadn't stood for them, not at first. He had stood because he couldn't do anything else. Because something in him, something older and quieter than pride, had said, "I will not be moved." The doorbell rang softly, cutting through the hush of the morning. Marvin rose slowly, Bear shifting to stand beside him. He opened the door to find a young man in a crisp uniform, his posture straight, his eyes calm and respectful. "Sergeant Smith?" he said quietly. Marvin inclined his head. "Yes." The young man extended a small envelope, the seal of the Pentagon pressed into the thick paper. "This is for you," he said. "With respect." Marvin took it slowly, his fingers tracing the seal before he slipped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal recognition of the stand he had taken, signed by a name he recognized and a name he knew would stand behind it. He let out a slow breath, the weight of the words settling into his chest like a quiet promise. Then he looked up, his gaze meeting the young man's steady eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. The young man nodded once. "It was an honor," he said softly. As the door closed behind him, Marvin set the letter down on the table, the words already etched into the quiet places of his memory. Bear nudged his leg, the gentle weight of the dog's head a steady anchor. Marvin smiled faintly, his hand resting in the thick fur. "We're still here," he murmured. "And we're not going anywhere." Because he understood now, in a way he never had before, that dignity wasn't something you wore like a uniform or pinned to your chest. It was something you carried in the quiet weight of your choices, in the small stands you took when no one else was watching. And in the soft light of the winter morning, Marvin knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. Because some stands echo louder than any shout. And some promises, the quiet ones, last forever. The last of the snow had melted by the time Marvin stepped out again. The city washed clean in the soft light of an early spring morning. He paused at the top of the worn steps outside his apartment. His white cane in one hand, Bear pressed close to his leg. The street was quiet, the hush of dawn wrapping the world in a gentle calm. Marvin let his breath slow, each inhale steady and sure. He could feel the echo of the day before in every step he took, not as a burden, but as a quiet strength that had settled into his bones. Bear nuzzled his leg, the dog's tail wagging in a slow, measured rhythm. "Come on, buddy," Marvin murmured, his voice low but sure. "Let's go see the world." They walked slowly, each step a quiet testament to the choice he had made. The memory of the taser still flickered at the edges of his mind, the cold jolt, the sharp crackle of electricity, but it no longer held the power to define him. That moment was a part of him, but it was not the whole. As they moved down the street, Marvin felt the eyes of the city on him, some curious, some uncertain, but all held in the quiet hush of respect that had grown around his choice to stand. He passed the small bakery at the corner, the warm scent of fresh bread drifting out to greet him. The young woman behind the counter looked up, her face bright with recognition. "Morning, sir," she said softly, her smile warm and sure. Marvin inclined his head, the small movement enough. He didn't need to say more, the quiet dignity of the moment was its own kind of conversation. At the next corner, he paused, the rhythm of the city soft in his ears. Bear pressed close, his head lifting to catch a sound Marvin couldn't hear. The dog's calm presence was an anchor, the quiet promise of loyalty stronger than any shout. Marvin closed his eyes for a moment, the soft breeze on his face, the warmth of the sun a gentle blessing. He thought of the convoy, of the soldiers who had come for him in the hush of a winter morning. He thought of the way the world had paused, just for a moment, to watch a man refuse to be moved. And he thought of the promise he carried in every breath, that no matter how loud the world tried to shout, some stands didn't need to be seen to matter. Some stands were quiet, but they echoed in the hearts of those who understood. As he turned to make his way home, the rhythm of his footsteps steady and sure, Marvin felt the weight of that promise settle into the quiet places of his chest. Each step was a gentle echo, a reminder that dignity wasn't something you demanded. It was something you chose. And as he and Bear moved through the city that had learned, if only for a moment, to see him, Marvin knew he would keep choosing it. Every day, every breath, because some stands didn't need an audience. They just needed a heart that refused to be moved. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity is a quiet choice and loyalty never fades, please subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video. Because some voices don't shout, they echo forever.